We live at a time with a lot of profound challenges to the international system, a lot of conflicts, a realignment going on all over the place. It's very hard to keep track of what's really transpiring. So these are very vexed, very tense time in global affairs. And here we are on the cusp of a crucial US presidential election. From the outside, we don't seem to have a particularly inspiring choice, but nonetheless, it clearly is a watershed election that's forthcoming. Trump versus Biden, the future of US foreign policy under either of these gentlemen going forward. Danny, the floor is yours, the microphone is yours. We're looking forward to what you have to tell us, and there'll be plenty of opportunity for Q&A and discussion afterwards. Danny, welcome.
Thanks so much, Colin. It's such a pleasure to be virtually here with all of you. You know, whenever I get an invitation to a webinar, I think, good God, but when you asked, I really jumped at the opportunity. First of all, AIJAC is such a wonderful organization. And second of all, lots of friends are part of this. So for me, it's really a way to stay in touch as well with the things that matter in Australia and Melbourne, of course, but all over Australia. So thank you to all of you for having me. You know, you asked a very very hard question when we talk about what the implications for foreign policy are for the next election. You know, what we tend to think of when we have an incumbent in one seat, Donald Trump in the White House, and an outsider coming in, is that we have a choice between the status quo or change. And the reality, of course, is that for a lot of us, and I think a concern for a lot of us, is that in fact, we're not really necessarily looking at the status quo in a second Donald Trump term. We are in fact looking at two potential change scenarios in the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So, you know, let's start with Donald Trump for a moment. So, you know, again, a lot of pro-Israel people are quite positive about Donald Trump when they look simply through that prism, where they may not love him on a variety of other issues, you know, domestic policies, economic policies, whatever it is. A lot of people who are pro-Israel have been very comfortable with Donald Trump, not simply because he had, and I'm going to say this sort of crudely, the guts to implement what was then a 20-year-old law, the U.S. Jerusalem Embassy Relocation Act, and move our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That was a terrific thing. He's maintained a close relationship with the leadership in Israel, although he's been strangely careful for him about domestic politics inside Israel, and has rejected the idea that somehow this is solely a Netanyahu-based relationship. But perhaps more importantly than the direct relationship with Israel, Donald Trump has been extraordinarily tough on Israel's number one enemy, Iran, and Iran's proxies, whether it's Hezbollah or it's Hamas or it's others. And for a lot of people who look at the region, especially the region after we saw how that relationship can go south under Barack Obama, this was sort of a breath of fresh air, real positive. And I think that people who care about Israel were relieved. There are questions, though. There are a lot of questions. So let's just sort of start quickly with Iran. And let me just look down, because I have no idea what time it is, and make sure that I don't blather on. Otherwise, I could suck up the entire hour. So on the question of Iran, I think a lot of people don't appreciate what the president's agenda is. So every single candidate for the Republican nomination in 2016 said that they would rip up the JCPOA, the so-called Iran deal. Every candidate except Jeb Bush, if anybody remembers Jeb Bush. And my estimation at the time was that none of them meant it. That once they came into office, they would grow as so many do in office, and they would be advised not to do it by the State Department, by the Defense Department, by our allies, by Australia, and that they would step back. Well, you know, allies are to Donald Trump like, you know, ex-wives, whatever. Their views on these things are not hugely important. And despite enormous pressure from even our very close friends in London, but also from Paris and Berlin, the president decided that the United States should step away from the Iran deal and reimposed a huge number of sanctions. It's important to understand that for most of us who didn't like the JCPOA, but were hesitant about it, one of the main reasons why we were hesitant about pulling out of the JCPOA was because we thought it would be very difficult for the United States to unilaterally reimpose sanctions that would actually be, to use Hillary Clinton's word, crippling. In fact, the Trump administration, love them, hate them, and my, you know, most ardent Democratic friends will agree with me on this, has done a remarkable job in not simply reimposing the sanctions that existed before the JCPOA, but imposing a much stronger regime of sanctions that has bitten on the Iranians like nothing they've ever seen in their 40-plus year reign. So, you know, the Iranian oil exports are at rock bottom. The Iranian currency has lost much of its value. And the Iranian regime is isolated in many ways. Even the Europeans now are deeply concerned about it. And the Iranians have tried to leverage their position by stepping outside the JCPOA and no longer honoring their commitments on the nuclear front, but also on a variety of other fronts. I don't know whether that's going to stand. But if we take that whole picture and we just step back for a moment, one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, okay, sanctions are a tool. What does Donald Trump want? And I think here we really have a bifurcation. Donald Trump's administration wants to crush the Iranian regime, put them in a position where they are so weak that eventually they will fall. The president, I believe, maybe incorrectly, he does not confide in me, the president wishes to pull a North Korea with Iran. He would like to sit down with Ayatollah Khamenei or President Rouhani and do a deal, a better deal than the JCPOA. The Iranian government has not been willing to do that, but there have definitely been feelers sent out to them from the White House to see whether they might be willing to sit down. Okay, so all by way of a very rather long emphasis on this question of Iran, because it probably is one of the central issues. Okay. Now, let's talk about Joe Biden. Now, because you know everybody sees everything through the prism of their own experience, I knew Joe Biden when he was the ranking member, the top Democrat of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. As top Democrat at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I suspect he would have thought that the JCPOA was a bunch of rubbish, as indeed the person who succeeded him in that position, Bob Menendez, did. But as vice president under Barack Obama, he was a great enthusiast. And what we have is a group of people advising Vice President Biden in his candidacy for president to rejoin the JCPOA under certain circumstances, or maybe to rejoin JCPOA plus, because JCPOA at a certain point is really a kind of a dead letter. The Iranians are not abiding by its terms. And the question for everybody is, what is JCPOA plus? What are the Iranians going to get back? And is it a good idea to squander the leverage that Donald Trump, whether wise or unwise, has accumulated over these 4 years of very, very tough sanctions on Iran? I don't know the answer to that question. And I will tell you now, coming out sort of away from 5,000 feet to 30,000 feet, I think for a lot of us, this is the real problem, okay? We don't actually know what Donald Trump is going to do in his second term, right? For example, will he feel liberated and pull the United States out of NATO? Will he feel liberated and shut down all sorts of immigration as he has done during the coronavirus? Will he feel liberated and be, you know, governed more to the right or potentially even more to the left? Remember, he has been his whole life until he ran for president a Democrat, and is surrounded, by the way, by Democrat political appointees. So for a lot of us, you know, term 2 Donald Trump is not entirely clear. The same problem exists with Joe Biden. So, you know, I just did an interview for a documentary that CNN is doing on Joe Biden. And one of the things that I said was, I would really be tempted to vote for 1995 Joe Biden. He's a centrist Democrat, absolute foreign policy hawk. He supported the Iraq War, which I did. He was tough on Iran. He was tough on, he was a big NATO supporter. He was a big supporter of NATO expansion at a time when it was not easy. The White House wasn't there. He was a sort of a Joe Lieberman in many ways in terms of his place, very pro-Israel. But he's 78 years old. And in the interim, he's also been vice president under Barack Obama. More importantly, all of the people who work with Joe Biden are not 78 years old. And the younger part of the Democratic Party in the United States is much to the left of where he was in 1995. So how is he going to govern? Is he going to govern more like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? Or Elizabeth Warren? Or Bernie Sanders, who told MSNBC last week that Biden is going to be the most progressive president since FDR? I actually thought that was a sly attempt to take votes away from Biden, but I could be wrong. So is Biden going to be that man that's governed by a party that is increasingly anti-Israel, that is increasingly hostile to not just a Likud government in Israel, but to any government in Israel, who believes that the analogy between South Africa under apartheid and Israel is the correct one? Because that, to me, is the center of gravity of the Democratic Party. And I worry not so much about Biden as president, but Biden as president and who will be working for him. Will he get back in the JCPOA? Probably yes. Will he move the embassy back to Tel Aviv? You know, this is a hysterical issue. So I had not realized it, but the State Department sold the land on which our embassy was on Hayav Korn Street in Tel Aviv. So even if they wanted to move back to Tel Aviv, it wouldn't be easy. And I gather they've also sold the residence of the ambassador. So I may be getting the embassy itself wrong, but I know they sold the residence. And so, you know, the question of whether they're going to move back the embassy, I think, is one that is going to be much harder. But, you know, are they going to be as tough on China? You know, from Australia, you know, this is AIJAC, but you're still Australians as well as pro-Israel. On China, I think there's no question that the Trump administration has been extraordinarily tough. Okay, but what's second term Donald Trump going to do? He's extraordinarily transactional. Is he going to step back from all of the tough moves on China in exchange for some paltry deal in which China buys $250 million worth of chicken parts? You know, don't put it past him, because this is what's happened in the past. On China, a Biden administration, would they be as tough? His background is certainly not tough. He didn't take China seriously. He didn't take Russia seriously. Remember what Barack Obama said to Mitt Romney when they were debating in the 2012 election. The 1980s called, and they want their foreign policy back, when Mitt Romney suggested that Russia was a geopolitical, geostrategic threat. So which Joe Biden is going to greet us? The Joe Biden who understood that NATO expansion was a good idea in the 90s, or the Joe Biden who worked for Barack Obama who thought it was all a big joke? We don't know. Last bit that I think we need to be wary about, and then I'll hand things back over to Colin, and perhaps we can all have a conversation, which will be much more fun for me and for you. But one more question is this. Almost everything in the United States political sphere revolves around Donald Trump. Okay, so for the Democrats, a lot of what has animated their policy is to be anti-Donald Trump. In other words, if Trump wants it, it's bad, and therefore we're against it. So, for example, a party that was largely indifferent to Russia before 2016 now believes that Russia is a huge challenge. Once Trump is gone, if Trump is gone next year, will that continue to be the case? Okay. Will the Democratic Party continue? Will a President Biden be tough on Russia? Will a President Biden be tough on China trade, but also on China strategically in the South China Sea? Will a Biden administration stand with stand with our allies in Southeast Asia and throughout Asia against the growing Chinese threat? Or will this have been something that was viewed as, well, Trump alienating one of the most important countries in the world and a vital trading partner? Don't know, don't know. And it's not just because Joe Biden is stuck in his basement and that we haven't heard from him. It's because, genuinely speaking, we don't know who is going to govern. A little bit nervous about another Trump term, nervous about a Biden term as well. So with that, let me hand it back up to you, Colin, and maybe we can do some Q&A.
Thanks, Danny. Thank you very much for that. As I said at the start, the best way of being able to raise your hand is at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a participation tab. Click that. At the bottom of the list of participants, you'll see a raise hand feature. So please use that feature to indicate your desire to ask a question. If you're a little bit camera shy, the chat feature is currently disabled on this particular Zoom call, so you can email your questions to jjones@aijac.org.au. And then Jeremy will supply me with the questions from there. I'd like to hand over to Colin to give the first question or two.
Okay, thanks very much, Joel. Danny, thanks for setting all this up. You made a number of very scintillating remarks, setting the scene for a good discussion, I'm sure. Just picking up where you left off, the 5-letter word, China. Obviously, it is becoming increasingly problematic in terms of its behaviour, especially for Australia, the US as well, and of course elsewhere. And there is bipartisan concern, certainly in Australia and in the United States. But linking it to your earlier comments about the centrality of the Iran issue, and this is a foremost issue in international affairs, the prospect of a China-Iran deal that we're now seeing in some detail that would vastly expand Chinese presence in Iranian banking and telecommunications, ports, railways, and so many other areas in exchange for Iranian oil, of course, as well as the possibility of military cooperation. And with the arms embargo on Iran coming off as early as October, the prospect of huge markets in Iran for China and probably for Russia as well is deeply concerning. So this is a real worry, and a twofold sort of question here. Firstly, I think, Australia properly has been standing up to the bullying of China, but it should also indicate to us a little bit more concern about Iran and its behaviour, where I believe Australia should have another look at its posture on Iran, but it would reinforce our concerns about China. But in particular, I also raised the question of Israel, which has extensive commercial relationships with China as well, as most countries, including Australia, these days do. But its relationships extend across a range of areas. There is still a very high level of affinity and sort of favourable view of China in Israel, but increasing concern in Washington that those relationships could damage ties with the United States for strategic reasons as well. I would say that an element of concern even in Australia and elsewhere. My point is, should this imminent agreement be a wake-up call for a number of countries, especially in this case, Israel, I would say, as well as for ourselves. And should Israel be re-examining its ties, not just for the interests of the United States, Australia, or anyone else, but most importantly, really for itself?
Thanks, Colin. That's a really important question. And by the way, when you can see me, I've got you all in gallery view. So I said this when I spoke to AIJAC when I was in Melbourne, but let me just say again, there are very few places in the world where I can go and look at the gallery view and feel like I know just dozens and dozens of people. Thank you all. This is mostly my family friends. So I'm very grateful and pleased to see everybody. I really am. I can't pick everybody out by name and don't want to, but thank you all for being here. So Colin, your question is really important. Let me just sort of pick the smallest issue, if you want, out of this, which is the Israel-China relationship. This has been a thorn in the side of the United States for decades. Okay, it's not a Xi Jinping problem. It has been a problem from before him, from before the current government in Israel, certainly before this administration in the United States. And every administration, Republican and Democrat, has gone to the Israelis and said the moral diplomatic equivalent of, what the hell do you think you're doing? Okay. It is not simply a question of Israel's arms self-sufficiency. Any country that has an arms industry cannot simply have its own, its own military as a client. Okay, it's not sustainable, and we understand that. And Israel wants to be self-sufficient in a lot of areas that are very important to it, and it needs to sell. And we understand that the United States buys a lot of advanced technology from Israel. The United States develops advanced technology with Israel, but Israel's relationship with China and its willingness to sell certain goods is just a blind spot. Absolutely sort of unbelievable. And it continues to this day. And I know that the Trump administration has raised this at the highest levels repeatedly on every visit, and for reasons that, again, I understand, mercantilist reasons. Israel has thought that it can get away with this. At a certain point, it is going to come back and bite them hard when somebody realizes that, almost certainly not by intention, Israel has sold technology that advances the Chinese position against the United States in a place like the South China Sea. It is a huge mistake. Okay, Israel, a country like Taiwan, should empathize with Taiwan rather than being buddy-buddy with Beijing. Now, on this question, and sorry for that rather long answer, but I think it's hard for people to understand just how angry people in Washington are about this and how strangely oblivious the Likud and the Labour Party and everybody in between in Israel is about this problem. On this question of China and Iran, Colin, it's a terrific question. The New York Times, I gather, has seen this agreement, and it is worth a great deal to Iran. It is really a lifeline. I described the state of the Iranian economy and their global isolation at this point. What the Chinese are doing is they're walking in sort of, I don't even want to say Belt and Road style, because Belt and Road is much more opportunistic, much more casual. This has a dual strategic and economic purpose. The economic purpose is obvious. China imports 75% of its oil. It needs a supplier. It likes having its foot on the neck of whoever is supplying it anything. And right now, the geopolitical situation has meant that they can have a lot of leverage over Iran. I'm sure they negotiated themselves a great deal. Then we have the banking and we have everything else. But in addition, this is an opportunity for Beijing to basically say, screw you to Washington. You may think that Iran is a bad actor, but we, of course, in Beijing understand and have a much wider view, and we recognize, that the Iranians have these rights. This is not going to end well, in my estimation, because we have secondary sanctions on companies that do the sorts of things that are listed in the agreement as the details of the New York Times article lay out, whether it's banking or it's the importation of petroleum or petroleum products or its investment in Iran. If that's going to be the case, if we see the major actors among Chinese state-owned companies, major actors among Chinese banks, they're going to be under sanctions. Now, if you had said to me 3 years ago, the United States is going to sanction major Chinese companies and major Chinese state-owned institutions, I would have said to you, good luck with that. But, and here, one of the few silver linings of the coronavirus, okay, the world has a different attitude toward China right now. The world is sick and tired of China's games. Okay? We have lost hundreds of thousands of people not to speak of trillions of dollars, because the Chinese were insufficiently alert to and honest about a deadly virus that broke out in Wuhan. Okay? Countries like Britain, which wanted to stay with Huawei against the express recommendations of the United States, have changed their mind. I understand that the Germans are rethinking, and the Germans, as we all know, are unbelievably mercantilist when it comes to foreign policy. Even they are rethinking Huawei. If the Chinese put us in a position where we need to land on them sanctions-wise because of Iran, I think that we could look at the Europeans being willing to come along with us because they are so angry and because they recognize the imperative of diversifying away from their dependence on China in a whole variety of ways. Really long answer, and I'll try to be more succinct in future, but that was a huge question.
No, that was perfect, Danny. I appreciate it. Next question will go to AIJAC's Naomi Levine.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks everyone for joining today. I've got a question about some of the recent reports of explosions in Iran and the attacks on Iran. Now, we know they've caused a lot of damage, but nobody's officially taken responsibility for them. Can you tell us a little bit more about those attacks? What implications have they had in Iran, and any other information that you know about them?
So, I mean, I think I know probably as much as we all know on this program. There have been a number of explosions. The Iranians, it's been very interesting. The Iranians in the beginning made up excuses. This was a gas explosion. This was an internal thing. They've now started to admit that there is sabotage at work. Is it physical sabotage? Is it cyber sabotage? Whatever it is, whoever is behind it, and I have a feeling about who's behind it, but I don't know. And more importantly, I don't know whether whoever is behind it is alone or is working in cooperation with somebody else. Whoever it is has some extremely sophisticated cyber capabilities at their fingertips and may well, again, I'm speaking as much off the top of my head and without any particular knowledge, but may well have some help on the ground inside Iran. Remember, you know, we're on the outside. We'll look at Iran and we look at what they're doing in Iraq. We look at what they've done to both Australian soldiers and American soldiers. We look at what they're doing in Syria. We look at what they've done to Lebanon. We look at what they've done to Israel. We look at Iran and we see how they behave in their region. But for the Iranian people, of course, they have to live with these people. You know, this is a ruthless police state. So the notion that somebody on the ground may well be helping whoever it is on the outside is not ridiculous. All I can say is keep it up. It's fantastic. It's got the Iranian government absolutely off its keel, not sure what's going on, extraordinarily angry, lashing out. But, and again, credit to Donald Trump in this regard, right? The Iranians don't feel like they can, for example, step up with Hezbollah. In previous situations where the Iranians have been under threat, under attack, where they felt very nervous about what's happening at home, they have tried to distract from that, okay, by using one of their proxies to force us all to look over here. No, don't look at me here, look over there, right? And they've used Hezbollah, particularly in situations like this, to hit northern Israel. Now, we know that Hezbollah has probably 100,000 missiles in its arsenal, and yet they've got problems at home. We haven't seen that. That is a testament to how constrained the Iranian government is, and yay for that.
Thank you. Then we'll go to AIJAC's Sharon Middleman.
Hi, Jenny. Thanks for that. Iran also has its hold on Lebanon through Hezbollah, and I understand you called for America to withdraw their ambassador from Lebanon. Can you discuss a bit of the impetus for that, and also the protests in Lebanon, and whether that may change the sentiment towards Hezbollah in Lebanon today?
It's a great question, and look, you know, what I said was, for too long we've been willing to sort of pretend that there's a state of Lebanon, this mythical state of Lebanon that exists separate from Hezbollah. Okay, Hezbollah dominates the government, they dominate the political scene, they dominate the military scene, and they are a terrorist organization. They've been responsible for the death of untold numbers of Syrians, 500,000 total, but also Americans, Israelis, Lebanese. This pretense should end, in my opinion. The demonstrations that broke out in Lebanon broke out last November, and they had nothing to do with the Zionists, and nothing to do with Syria, and nothing to do with Iran. They were purely domestic, and it was a protest about corruption, lack of rule of law, bad governance. Okay, we all know what bad governance looks like. We're lucky to have bad governance in great systems. In Lebanon, they've got bad governance and a terrible system. And the question for me is, how much of a distraction is this for Hezbollah? We should make no mistake, this has definitely been one of their biggest challenges. It's really great to be in opposition. You have, we always used to say when we were in the minority on Capitol Hill, it's power without responsibility. For Hezbollah, that's been very much the same. And suddenly they were chasing a dog of the government in Lebanon. They caught it. Now they don't know what to do with it. The Lebanese pound has disappeared. At a certain point 2 months ago, you couldn't withdraw any money from the bank. Prior to that, they had put a limitation of about $250 on withdrawals from the bank. The Lebanese economy is in free fall. And honestly, we need to say that Lebanon is a failed state. So what should happen? I have absolutely no idea. But this should be an opportunity for us to crush, in many ways, Hezbollah, to push them down and to help other Lebanese groups who hope to stand up. The problem is there aren't a lot of great, courageous people there who we can help. And the other problem is there isn't consensus, even certainly not among our allies, not in Australia at all, but even in the United States, there isn't consensus between the State Department and our military, for example. Our military loves the Lebanese armed forces. The State Department is like, why? And so we have no consensus. Lebanon just doesn't matter anymore. And that was what I said at the end of the article. I said the biggest problem for Lebanon is no one really cares what the outcome is anymore, not even the Israelis.
I'll now send it over to AIJAC's Ovid Lobel.
Hi, Danny. Thanks for doing this. I just wanted to ask you about your assessment of the killing of Qasem Soleimani in January, and whether you think it had impacted Iran's strategic plans or actions in any way.
Actually, it's amazing to me we haven't talked about it. And, the United Nations just came out and condemned the killing of Qasem Soleimani. The same person, the special rapporteur, was the woman who investigated the Khashoggi murder by the regime of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. I'm not a huge fan of hers. She's highly political, and so it was no surprise to me that she came out and said that the United States taking out Qasem Soleimani was illegal. To me, there are plenty of good legal arguments for it, but there are even more important strategic arguments for it. Those who said Qasem Soleimani is just a man and he will be replaced were full of it, to put it in the proper political science terms. They didn't know what they were talking about. It is very important to understand just how vital Qasem Soleimani was to the Quds Force, but to the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that are the stalwart of the regime. He is the one who helped build up Hezbollah. He is the one who helped build up all of the other expeditionary forces. He is the one who had the vision with the Houthis in Yemen. He is the one who was managing the so-called Hashd al-Sha'bi, the popular mobilization units that Iran runs in Iraq. He was a mastermind, a smart guy. And when you get rid of somebody like that, sure, they can put somebody else in his job. They put his deputy Iran in his job. He's not as good, okay? He's not as smart. He doesn't have the wasta. He doesn't have the influence inside the Iranian government. And I've got to say, I thought it was a hugely courageous and very meaningful step. And I was delighted to see him go. And so were a lot of people inside Iran and in the region.
I believe Jeremy Jones has a question that was emailed to him. Jeremy.
Yes, thank you. There have been a few questions. I'll do one at a time. The progressive left faction of the Democratic Party has ascendancy at the moment. And the question is, to what extent do you think they will influence the Biden administration in a number of foreign policy areas broadly? And I just wanted to know your assessment on which areas of foreign policy there might be biggest changes and what concerns we should have as allies of America.
Yeah, that's a terrific question and a very hard one to ask. You know, I'm not privy to anybody's inner circle at this point. I'm not a big fan of the president, so I'm not a big fan of the Democratic Party either. But obviously, we are a pretty small community of internationalist foreign policy people in Washington. So there are I have plenty of Democrats in you know who are dear and close friends. I'm very worried about that. And I'll tell you why. Joe Biden is, he's a good man. And 78 isn't that old, you know. Yes, it was the age that Ronald Reagan was when he left office, but we've gone very far since then. The problem for those of us who know Biden is that he's not a young 78. He's old, and people very politely say he's lost a step, but the truth is he hasn't lost a step, he's lost a lot of steps. And so where a younger Biden would have been a very firm leader, I'm worried that an older Biden is not going to be a firm leader. Everybody in a Biden administration is going to have their eye on their future, not on his future. Not on him and his approbation, but on the approbation of the party. And that's why I worry about the center of gravity inside the Democratic Party, especially on issues like this. Where do I worry the most? The progressive wing is terrible on Israel. Terrible. You know, America is a country that has always been pro-Israel, not pro-Likud, not pro-Labor, not pro-Jew, pro-Israel. You know, we love us. We love us some underdogs. We love a scrappy country that has forged for itself an enormous place in history, but also in the Middle East. That is not the case in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. J Street, the sort of anti-AIPAC organization, Jewish Democratic, whatever it's called, the counterpart to the Republican Jewish Coalition. They are very hostile to the embassy being where it is, very hostile to Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And I worry a lot that we will stop supporting Israel in a variety of places, that we will, and that we will revert to something I've written about before, which is a very, very dangerous thing, which is that Israel belongs to the Republican Party, right? And Iran belongs to the Democrats. That's crazy. It's crazy for the Democrats. It's crazy for the Republicans. That the Republicans should be the party of Sunni Islam and the Jews, you know, in the Middle East, and that the Democrats should be the party of the Shiites. Seems to me to be insane. But it is absolutely, and it sounds simplistic, but it's absolutely how things are shaken out. And I worry very much that some of the younger people who are in the Biden program, not Tony Blinken, not the old guard of the Biden world, but the younger people who are going to be at the implementing level are going to be very hostile, very much more pro-Iran, much more willing to accommodate this regime, much less willing to take the kind of hard steps that are necessary, much more hostile to the Gulf Arabs who are going to do stupid things in response, and much more hostile to Israel. I worry a lot.
Okay, the next one that came into me actually came while you were answering your question about Lebanon, or the earlier question on Lebanon. It was also, Australia only prescribed the external security organization of Hezbollah as terrorists. Would it make a difference if we banned the entire group?
Of course. It's ridiculous. I'm sorry. When France has a better foreign policy than Australia on something like this, you know something's wrong. So, you know, Australia has a huge Lebanese community, and I understand that there are concerns about this, but Hezbollah is no friend to Lebanon. Look what they've presided over. Do you realize, I'll put this in my piece and I'm happy to share it with anybody who drops me a line afterwards. You know, do you realize that in Beirut, which used to be called the Switzerland of the Middle East or the Paris of the Middle East, they don't have electricity 24 hours a day? Okay, this isn't Iraq. Okay? They weren't just in the middle of a war. They don't have electricity because of government corruption. Who's making that money? Hezbollah is making that money through the president and through the prime minister and the former prime minister. It is a travesty. And the notion that somehow Australia wants to split the difference and, you know, suggest that there's a military wing rather than a political wing is a facade that nobody signs up to anymore. Nobody. When the European Union is ahead of you, you know that you're losing your way.
Thank you. Now, just a reminder, any questions that you'd like, email jjones@aijac.org.au, and as well as the bottom, you'll see the participant list, and the hands up function will allow you to raise your hand. I want to go back to Colin. Something's piqued his interest, and I'd like Colin to have the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. I wanted to hop in. I can't let Danny go without addressing or elaborating on a comment you made earlier about really traditional alliances. You know, from an Australian point of view, it looks like a fairly problematic outlook going forward. We just had a government bring down a $280 billion military plan and expenditure in forthcoming years. We want to know, as do all the countries in Asia Pacific, whether we can continue to rely on the United States, which has been the backbone of our security in the post-war years. And our prosperity, I dare to say. And I add that with regard to President Trump, what one friend sort of said to me is, look, you have to wince at some of the things he says, but really look at what he does rather than what he says. And when I look at 2 US aircraft carrier groups in the South China Sea at the moment, the Reagan-Nimitz groups, you feel a little bit more reassured. So going forward, you know, from the point of view of Australia in particular, and we're looking at regional allies, the Quad, I think, is gaining more significance now, Japan, India, United States and Australia, and other multilateral groups, I think, you know, important adjunct to our involvement and continued sort of relationship and reliance to some extent on the United States. What do you think going forward in terms of reliance on the United States under President Trump and certainly under a Biden presidency? What do we see?
No, it's a very fair question. What the Biden people will say to you is, in fact, it was they who executed what was then labeled the pivot to Asia. And it was they who recognized the geostrategic threat that Beijing suddenly represented. And it was they who changed American orientation to reassure our allies in Asia that we would be there in case the Chinese misbehaved. The reality, and this isn't my area of expertise, but Zach Cooper, who's my colleague at AEI, has written very nicely on this. The reality is that that the pivot, unfortunately, was nothing more than rhetoric. Okay, we've got a small number of American troops in Darwin, next door to the Chinese, by the way. Thanks, guys, and nothing else. That's all the Obama administration did. We did some what we call freedom of navigation exercises to remind the Chinese that we don't respect their claims, that the 9-dash line is not a thing for us. But that was it. We never were willing to confront them. And in fact, when they confronted us, we downplayed it, and that was the way it was. Now, that has not been the way it is under the Trump administration. And Colin, you know, people say, well, you just can't listen to Donald Trump. Unfortunately, that comes with the package. I agree with you. You know, if it were just the policies, I'd be a lot more comfortable. You know, unfortunately, the words have meaning as well. But I do think that we have I do think that we have stepped up in Asia. I do think that we have reassured our friends in Taiwan. And right now, that's for me the next domino. That's my biggest worry, is that a Beijing unleashed will think that after having taken and stuffed Hong Kong into its wallet, they are going to finish up their business with Taiwan. And obviously, we have defense obligations towards Taipei. What that will mean for the United States should be a big question on everybody's mind. I know it's a big question on Tsai Ing-wen's mind. When she won, the real question for us is not whether a Biden administration would engage in the rhetoric that is necessary to condemn what the Chinese have done in Hong Kong or what the Chinese are doing vis-a-vis Iran. The real question is whether they are going to resource that that rhetoric with the kind of military shows of force that are necessary. We need the Chinese to understand that we mean business. We need the Chinese, most importantly, to understand that they must not miscalculate what our intentions are, and we need to work more closely, even more closely than we currently are, not just with Australia, which had this very important plus up in your defense spending, but with all of our allies. We've got a problem in the Philippines with Duterte. Everybody has a problem in the Philippines with Duterte. I hope that at a certain point that too can be resolved. But vis-a-vis all of the other countries, whether it's Vietnam or Indonesia or anybody else, or of course you back at home in Australia, we need to be there. We are a Pacific country as well as an Atlantic country. And America needs to be reminded more often and more forcefully of the threat that represents. I'm very nervous about what a Biden administration would do. Very nervous, because I think they haven't thought through what their intentions are at all.
Thank you for that. Let's go to member of the AIJAC editorial board, Gary Hertz.
Thank you, Danielle. Can you hear me? What impact?
I do.
Can you hear me now?
I still do.
No. Yeah. What impact did John Bolton's book have and his interviews have on the conservative think tanks, the conservative movement vis-a-vis Trump?
So John is a former colleague of mine at AEI. He's no longer at AEI. Look, I don't think John Bolton has said anything that in our darkest nightmares we didn't assume going forward. That's number one. Number two, the Wall Street Journal had an editorial right when the book came out, and they called John dishonorable. And I have to say, I think that's the right word. Not because I don't want to read the titillating details, not because I don't recoil in horror at the notion that the President of the United States is this person. That's a daily occurrence for us. But because you never want anyone, I don't care whether it's Obama or Clinton or Bush or Trump, you never want someone to go to work for the president with a view to writing a best-selling book afterwards, betraying, state secrets, betraying internal conversations. I think John should be ashamed of himself. Yes, Biden was thrilled. He said it was a great book, terrific. Did it actually change anything? No, I don't think it changed anything at the think tanks. John isn't affiliated with any think tanks. He isn't affiliated with any networks. He isn't affiliated with anything except himself at this point. But did it cement in our minds the idea that the president is not a terribly good person, not a terribly deep person, not a terribly thoughtful person? Yes, it did. Yes, it did. On the other hand, as Colin said, you don't just look at the person, you don't just look at the quality of the individual, you look at what they do. And in a lot of ways, you know, in a lot of ways, a lot of us who are national security hawks, who believe in our alliances, who believe that we need to stand by our allies, who believe that America is the most important and powerful country in the world. We've done some good things under Donald Trump, and I'm not going to take them away, even though John Bolton really wanted to make a lot of money.
Thanks, Dane. Now, we've only got a little bit of time left, so the rest of the few questions that we have left will be quick-fire questions. I'll hand over to Anthony Cohen.
Thank you, Danielle, for your talk. Just a couple of quick ones. Who do you think will be the chosen vice president for Biden? Because for obvious reasons, I think that's going to be pivotal. And secondly, why has the sexual harassment case against Biden seemed to have gone awfully cold in the media?
All I can tell you is the gossip that I hear. My Democratic friends think that Kamala Harris has the inside track. Close second is probably Tammy Duckworth. I'm looking across the table at my husband. Anyone else going to be vice president? Who do you think, Stephen? Yeah, see, he's with Harris too. So you've got unanimity at our kitchen table. We think she has the inside track right now. But anything can happen. We're going to find out pretty soon. On the sexual harassment question, I will tell you, a lot of the energy behind those charges came from different wings of the Democratic Party, not from the Republicans. And I think that there has been a war council that has very aggressively suggested to those who have been fanning those flames inside the Democratic Party to stop. That's a lot of big money. It's a lot of people who make a big difference inside the party. Why Fox News has stopped talking about it? Well, perhaps the lady involved has found reasons not to be as chatty as she was at the outset. I don't know. I think a lot of people found those charges not terribly creditable as well.
And our final round of questions will go to Jeremy Jones.
Thank you. I have one more that's been sent in, and then I'm going to ask for myself. Okay. Israel is considering extending its sovereignty to parts of the West Bank as part of the Trump administration's Middle East peace plan, but critics warn that doing so would badly damage support for Israel among US Democrats and a potential Biden administration. How much damage do you believe would be done by such a move?
I mean, you really left the hardest question for last, didn't you? I think a lot of damage will be done. I think a lot of people think that this is a step too far. I'm less concerned about the Democratic Party. The Arabs are very upset about it. I think that when you see the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates writing in the Israeli press, when you see others writing in the Israeli press, the Israelis have to realize that this will put at risk their newfound warm relationship with a lot of the Arab world. Does that mean they shouldn't do it? They're not going to get another chance to do it in a Democratic administration. So we may well see them do it. Will it cause more damage with the Democratic Party than would otherwise be the case? I think the way the Democratic Party is headed right now, Israel is in for a rocky ride, notwithstanding. And so as a matter of sort of calculation, if you're only looking at the Democrats and what it will do to the relationship, that's not that difficult to call. It's sort of a choice between a bad relationship and a worse relationship. In terms of the regional dynamic, I think Israel risks a real loss there. And I suspect that's one of the things that's causing them to hesitate.
I've just got another quick request for a question. So I'm going to go to Gus quickly, and then I'll head back to Jeremy to ask the final question.
Okay.
Thank you. Just a quick one. If your worst fears are realized, the Democrats are elected, and they turn out to be as bad or worse as you fear, what would you do if you were the Prime Minister of Israel?
I was about to say, well, luckily I've got an Australian passport, so I've got somewhere to go. But you made it harder. What would I do if I was the Prime Minister of Israel? Look, one of the things that I think has been badly mishandled by the Israelis, and weirdly, you know, again, also by the Saudis and the Emiratis, is that they've focused very much their relationship on their allies in the Republican Party, and they have let the Democratic Party drift away. You know, if you're Israel, you shouldn't be partisan. If you're Israel, no one should associate you with one party over another. And even if that party is obviously more friendly towards you, you should work doubly hard on the others. Now, I know that Ron Dermer, the outgoing Israeli ambassador to Washington, understands that. I know he's tried really hard, but he's got a lot of repair work to do. If I were the Prime Minister of Israel, I would focus like a laser beam on repairing those relationships and on outreach, not to the people who I can count on, but to the people who are, you know, who think BDS is a great idea, you know, who think that it forms a terrific part of the Black Lives Matter platform and that more people should embrace it. I'd be reaching out to them most aggressively because, you know, you don't need to suck up to your friends. You know, we're going to be there. You need to educate your enemies because they are the ones who are the most risk. And I think Israel has a very great case to make to not just the Republicans, not just conservatives, not just moderate Democrats, but to others, that Israel has always stood for the kind of ideals that these people believe that they stand for. So that's what I would do as Prime Minister. Vote for me.
Okay, final question. Thanks, Danny. Final question to Jeremy Jones before I'll come back and wrap up.
Thanks.
Thank you. You mentioned the impact of the coronavirus on impressions of China earlier on. The question relates to the impact of the coronavirus on the American political scene, whether it will have any impact whatsoever when it comes to your election shortly, either the impact of coronavirus within America or globally, what impact that might have on the American election. And in summary, has it helped the prospects of Joe Biden? And what are the prospects of Joe Biden winning the presidential election?
First of all, the conventional wisdom in the United States is that that this election is Joe Biden's to lose. Donald Trump has mishandled the coronavirus, not necessarily in terms of the steps that have been taken, but just in terms of the rhetoric. Okay? Because everything is about him. Everything is about whether he wears a mask or not, whether he likes Anthony Fauci or not, whether whether people respect what he has to say or about which medication is good for you or not. Those things have damaged him enormously, not just with the people who hated him already, but didn't matter, but with the people who really who were really on the fence, with the people who are the so-called persuadables that actually put him over the top last time. That said, it's July. It might as well be, 2010 as far as American electoral politics are concerned. The coronavirus has helped Joe Biden enormously. Why? Because whenever Joe Biden walks out of his basement, his stock goes down. It's exactly the same as Hillary Clinton in that regard. He does not do well when people scrutinize him. When he can hide in his basement, when he doesn't have to say anything, when he doesn't have to perform, and when his weaknesses are not on full display, he does much better. Now, that's not going to last forever. He's going to have to come out of the basement. He's going to have to debate Donald Trump. Trump is no great debater either, but we are going to be able to look at Joe Biden. That said, I think Trump has made a number of extraordinarily stupid mistakes, and he has, in many ways, handed what was a pretty likely prospect of re-election over to the Democrats. If Joe Biden wins the election, there will be one person to congratulate or to blame, whichever the side is, and that will be Donald Trump, because Biden will not win on his own merits. He will win because Trump lost.
Thank you very much for your time tonight, Danny. That was a fantastic webinar. I really appreciate it.